Welcome to Lesson 8-2. Today we're looking at Kennedy, Johnson, and civil rights, the perspective of American presidents on the issue of the 1950s and 60s. In the election of 1960, it was one of the closest in American history, a virtual tie. Prior to the election, neither John F. Kennedy nor Richard Nixon, the Democrat and Republican in this contest, seemed particularly strong on civil rights. Neither of them had embraced this as one of their issues earlier in their careers. But Kennedy seized an opportunity here and took steps to help out Dr. Martin Luther King when he was jailed during a protest. And through this action, he gains the support of the African American community, starts to be seen as a civil rights president, and this boost in support carries John F. Kennedy into the presidency in 1960. It was his position on civil rights that carried him over the edge, even though he hadn't previously been seen as a civil rights figure. Now, in 1961, we see the organization of a third civil rights organization that we should know. First, we had the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which we covered in Lesson 8-1. And then we had SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This one is CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. The Congress of Racial Equality in the 1960s is going to organize something called Freedom Rides. Freedom Rides was an attempt to desegregate interstate busing. Any bus that crossed state lines, went from, say, Mississippi into Alabama, would be covered by a provision in the U.S. Constitution which gives supervision of it to the federal government, not to state governments. So Mississippi can't decide to keep interstate buses segregated. Only the federal government can. Now, Freedom Riders were not popular going down into Mississippi and Alabama to try to enforce desegregation of buses. And they were frequently attacked. Sometimes explosives were even thrown at some of these buses. But Kennedy steps up into this role of a civil rights president. In much the way Eisenhower had protected the Little Rock Nine, Kennedy is going to protect CORE as they work to desegregate interstate buses, and later helps to usher through laws that will officially desegregate them. So Kennedy is stepping into that role as a civil rights president. Now, as these civil rights protests continue, Martin Luther King Jr. goes to Birmingham, Alabama, to protest to integrate all public facilities. Schools have been integrated through Brown versus Board of Education, buses through the Montgomery bus boycott. Now the push is for all public facilities, everything that is open to the public. Now, Birmingham was selected on purpose because it was seen as one of the most violently racist cities in America. And through SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the civil rights movement had learned that when violence is used against nonviolent protesters, it helps the nonviolent protesters. And the Public City Commissioner of Birmingham, Alabama, Eugene Bull Connor, falls right into that trap. As soon as they're down there with King doing nonviolent protests, Bull Connor attacks these peaceful protesters. And images of police attack dogs attacking and biting and ripping clothes from peaceful marchers in Birmingham just gets the nation fully behind this nonviolent civil rights protest. They are appalled by the use of violence by those who choose to remain segregated. This national support for that movement helps to convince Americans on the whole to support civil rights and to build support for a national civil rights law to ensure equality and equal access throughout America in all public facilities. The SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's organization, plans a demonstration called the March on Washington. And in the March in Washington, over 250,000 people, 250,000 people, march in Washington, D.C., centered around the mall, with the Washington Monument and Lincoln Monuments as their setting, where Martin Luther King Jr. gives his most famous of his many famous speeches, his I Have a Dream speech, in which he speaks about a world where people are seen not based upon the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This galvanizes the nation. America is now behind the idea of a civil rights law. Following the March on Washington, this was an action that needed to take place. The civil rights legislation would be passed. And Kennedy was pleased with these new laws. He was happy to put together the civil rights legislation. He had become this civil rights president, and he was looking forward to the day where it would become law. But if you know history at all, you know that John F. Kennedy's story does not have a happy ending, and he will not live to see that law enforced. On November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy is working to establish his presidential campaign for re-election and is down in Dallas, Texas. He's driving through the cities in an open-air convertible, waving and smiling to the people of Dallas. And as he is going through town, a man by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, who had set up in a book depository building with a rifle, shot the President of the United States while he was riding in this car and waving to supporters. Kennedy dies of those injuries. Now, Lyndon Johnson shortly thereafter becomes President of the United States. He is sworn in to the office while on an airplane flying back to Washington, D.C., after he has heard of Kennedy's death. He takes the oath of office and becomes President of the United States. Now, he moves very quickly on civil rights. Unlike Kennedy, who was a somewhat reluctant at first civil rights president, Lyndon Johnson had been in favor of civil rights through his career. He is a true civil rights guy. But realizing that there is still some resistance to civil rights, he ties this legislation into the memory of Kennedy. Kennedy was working on this before he died. Kennedy was excited. He wanted to see this legislation pass. Let's pass this law in memory of John F. Kennedy. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed and bans segregation in all public spaces in the United States of America. Segregation is illegal. It does not mean that all civil rights battles were won, however. Some states still restricted things like voting for African Americans. Voting rights are important because if you can't vote, you can't be represented in governments, and laws can be passed that are against African American interests. So SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organized the Freedom Summer to help Blacks register to vote. Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC also joined in on this effort and organized a march from Selma to Montgomery. Selma is a city near Montgomery, and they were going to march to protest for voting rights. Now, this march from Selma is again attacked. They get attacked by police officers while marching to Montgomery. And this, as had been seen before, increases support for the law. Violence used against nonviolent protests usually results in sympathy and support for the nonviolent side. And in 1965, Johnson happily signs the Voting Rights Act into law, which outlaws voter discrimination in America. This was one part of what President Johnson called his Great Society plan. Johnson wanted to go beyond civil rights. He wanted to pass laws to help the poor, to help the elderly, and to help women. He had a vision, a utopian vision of America, where everybody would be treated better and everybody would have their basic needs taken care of. He hoped to end discrimination, both racial and gender discrimination. He wanted to promote better education and access to education for all. He wanted to protect the environment. And he had a whole package of laws put together to work on this great society. And we'll look at how this turns out. However, on the civil rights side, there are setbacks. In 1968, 50 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. This assassination causes riots throughout the nation. The issue and the push for nonviolence is forgotten in those moments. And African Americans, upset, angry, frustrated at the slow progress of civil rights, erupt into violence throughout the country. And many civil rights leaders, including Malcolm X, this gentleman right here, had given up on peaceful integration. They didn't believe that peace could achieve their ends. Now, Malcolm X is an important figure because he doesn't hold this view for his whole life. He actually he's a Muslim, and he takes a trip to Saudi Arabia, as all Muslims are supposed to do at least once in their life. And in Saudi Arabia, he saw Muslims of many races from all over the world, all living and getting along in peace. And he realized that racial integration can happen. It should happen. And that he hopes to bring it to America. And he changes his message. He becomes a civil rights leader that shifts from a message of violence and uprising to one of peace and integration. However, like Dr. King, this does not sit well with everybody. And a member of his former organization, a member that was pushing for violent uprising, assassinates Malcolm X. And we lose another great civil rights leader. Well, I hope that you learned something today. Today was an important lesson in the history of civil rights in America. We'll certainly get into more later. Farewell.